I've always considered myself a lucky man. I married Whitney 10 years ago, and together we built a life that, at least on the surface, seemed ideal. We had two amazing kids, Ava, 6, and Dylan, 4, who were the center of my world. Whitney was a corporate attorney, sharp and ambitious, while I worked as a construction manager, putting in long hours to provide for my family. Our careers kept us busy, but we made it work. Or at least, I thought we did. A few years back, when Whitney's workload started to ramp up, we hired Susan, a nanny, to help take care of the kids. She was a kind, warm woman in her late 40s, and over time, she became more than just a caregiver. She was family. Susan lived in a small guest house on her property, and on particularly hectic days, she'd keep Ava and Dylan overnight. It was a perfect arrangement. Whitney and I could focus on work knowing our kids were in good hands. For years, I never questioned any of it. I trusted my wife. I trusted Susan. But trust has a funny way of making you blind. It started subtly. Whitney became different. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it began, but one day, I just realized she wasn't the same woman I'd married. She used to greet me with a warm smile when I came home from work, asking about my day. Now, she barely looked up from her phone. Dinners, which were once filled with laughter and conversation, turned into silent meals where she'd push food around on her plate, distracted. Even the way she hugged me changed. What once felt like home now felt like a formality. She was distant, distracted. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly between us became strained, filled with silence and half-hearted nods. She started pulling away from me, from the kids, from our routines. And I noticed. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Her job had always been demanding, but maybe it was wearing on her more than usual. I told myself she just needed time. Whitney had always handled stress well, yoga, venting to friends, unwinding with a book. But this time, she didn't do any of that. Instead, she buried herself in late nights at the office and left before I could ask too many questions. Then came the changes in her routine. Whitney had never been one to fuss over her appearance outside of special occasions, but suddenly, she started putting in more effort. New clothes, fresh manicures, different perfume. I wanted to believe it was harmless. Maybe she was just taking better care of herself. Maybe she needed the confidence boost. But then the late nights became more frequent. The business dinners that used to be once every couple of months were now a weekly occurrence. And the worst part? She never looked tired. I wanted to ignore it, to believe that I was just imagining things. I wanted to trust her like I always had, to convince myself that she was still the woman I married. But the doubt had already taken root, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it gnawed at me, demanding answers. But trust only works when both people play fair. And something inside me, the gut instinct that had kept me safe my entire life, was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. Whitney had just finished getting ready for another urgent meeting, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure in a way that wasn't exactly business casual. She kissed me on the cheek, something she'd stopped doing regularly months ago, and told me not to wait up. I watched her walk out the door, my stomach twisting in knots. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But belief isn't proof. And I needed proof. A few hours later, I picked up my phone and called Susan. I told myself I was just checking in on the kids, making sure they'd gone to bed okay. But as we talked, something in me snapped, and I asked, as casually as I could, if Whitney had stopped by to say goodnight before her meeting. Silence. A long pause. Then, finally, Susan said, "Oh, no, she hasn't been here all day." That was it. Just a simple statement. But it felt like a bullet to the chest. I barely heard the rest of our conversation. I muttered something about thanking her for watching the kids and hung up. My hands were shaking as I set my phone down. My mind raced, searching for any reasonable explanation, any way to convince myself that Whitney wasn't lying to me. But deep down, I already knew the truth. My wife, the woman I had given my heart and soul to, was deceiving me. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around me as my mind bombarded me with questions. Every time I closed my eyes, a fresh wave of doubt crept in, making my stomach churn. I clenched my fists, gripping the fabric beneath me, trying to force my thoughts to quiet down, but it was useless. Where was she going? Who was she with? How long had this been happening? And, more importantly, why? The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made coffee, ate breakfast with the kids, and waited for Whitney to come home. When she finally walked through the door, she didn't look guilty. She looked refreshed. Her hair was still perfectly styled, her makeup intact. She set her purse down and greeted the kids with a bright, chipper energy that made my skin crawl. I had to test her. So I asked, "How'd your meeting go?" She didn't hesitate, didn't stammer, didn't even blink. "Oh, it was fine. Just a long night, lots of paperwork." Her voice was smooth, effortless. Too effortless. Too rehearsed. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. Every odd excuse, every late night, every dismissive glance, things I had forced myself to overlook, all came rushing back. I had ignored the way she avoided my touch, the sudden secretiveness with her phone, the way she always had an excuse ready before I even asked a question. I had brushed it all aside, convincing myself I was overthinking. But now, I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was happening. And I was going to find out what it was. Something was happening. And I was going to find out what it was. The suspicion burned inside me, a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. I looked at Whitney, really looked at her, and for the first time in our 10 years of marriage, I saw a stranger. I didn't know exactly what she was hiding, but I was damn sure I was going to find out. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions. I needed proof. Cold, hard evidence. Whitney was careful, but nobody could hide everything forever. I had spent nights tossing and turning, replaying her excuses in my head, and I had reached my limit. I had to know. I trusted Susan. She had been good to my kids, good to my family. But I also knew that blind trust made a man weak. My gut told me something wasn't right, and I had learned to trust my gut more than the words coming out of anyone's mouth. If Whitney was lying to me, I needed to find out where, when, and how. And if Susan was covering for her, I needed to know that too. The solution came to me in the middle of the night. A nanny cam. Simple, discreet, and easy to set up. I spent the next morning researching hidden cameras, ones that wouldn't arouse suspicion. After work, I stopped by an electronics store and bought a small, high-resolution camera with night vision and remote access. If something was happening, I wasn't going to miss it. I drove straight to Susan's guest house that evening. She greeted me warmly, as always, the kids playing in the background. I told her I was installing a small security camera for extra protection. Just to be safe, I added. I don't want to take any chances with the kids here. Susan nodded, her expression unreadable, but she didn't protest. She trusted me. Or maybe she had no reason to suspect why I was really doing this. I positioned the camera in a place where it had a clear view of the main living area but was hidden enough not to be noticed. With the setup complete, I linked the feed to my phone. A live stream, available at any moment. If Whitney was using Susan's place as her hideaway, I would know soon enough. For the first few days, nothing. Just normal life. The kids ran around, Susan cooked meals, bedtime stories were read. It almost made me feel guilty for doubting. Almost. But deep down, the unease never left. It was only a matter of time. Then, on the 5th night, everything changed. It was just past 9 p.m. I was home alone, staring at my phone, the nanny cam feed open. The kids had been put to bed hours ago, and Susan had retired to her own room in the main house. But then, movement. At first, I thought it was Susan checking on something, but the figure that stepped into view was too familiar. Whitney. My breath caught in my throat. She wasn't supposed to be there. I sat up, gripping my phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. My wife was standing in Susan's guest house, the very place my kids slept. She checked her phone, glancing around, as if waiting for someone. And then he arrived. A man stepped into the frame. Tall. Well-dressed. Someone I didn't recognize. He walked in like he belonged there. Like he had done this before. Whitney's face lit up. She smiled in a way she hadn't smiled at me in a long time. The kind of smile that used to be mine. They embraced. Not like friends. Not like colleagues. It was intimate. Her hands lingered on his chest, his arms wrapped around her waist, their bodies pressed together like magnets drawn by something primal. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, mixing with the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. My fingers curled into fists, the phone shaking in my grasp, my knuckles turning white as a sharp, cold sweat broke out along my spine. I wanted to shut it off. I wanted to throw it across the room, smash it into 1,000 pieces so I wouldn't have to see what came next. But I didn't. I forced myself to watch. To endure every second of my wife's betrayal. He whispered something in her ear, and she laughed. That laugh. The one that used to be for me. Then she took his hand, leading him toward the bedroom. My stomach twisted, a sickening weight settling in my gut. I felt like I was drowning, sinking into something dark and suffocating. It wasn't just the cheating. It wasn't just the lies. It was where she was doing it. In a place meant for our children. A place that was supposed to be safe. Susan's house. My world shattered in that moment. The trust, the love, the years we had built, it all crumbled into dust. But I didn't move. I didn't scream. I didn't call her, demanding answers. Because this wasn't the time for rage. Rage makes you reckless. It makes you loud when you should be quiet, impulsive when you should be calculating. If I lashed out now, she'd just deny everything, twist the story, make me the villain. No, I needed to be smart. I needed to make sure that when I confronted her, there would be no escape, no excuses, no way for her to turn this around. This was the time for planning. The moment I saw Whitney disappear into that bedroom, I knew there was no saving this. No talking it out. No fixing what was already broken. But knowing wasn't enough, I needed proof. I needed undeniable, irrefutable evidence. The kind that left no room for gaslighting, no way for her to twist the truth in her favor. So I became a man with a mission. For the next 2 weeks, I watched, recorded, and documented everything. The lack of sleep clawed at me, my body running on nothing but adrenaline and quiet rage. I became obsessed, every spare moment spent replaying footage, scanning messages, analyzing every interaction. The more I uncovered, the more it consumed me. Every time Whitney thought she was slipping away unnoticed, I had my phone in hand, the Nanny cam feed open. The way she smiled at him. The way she leaned into his touch. Every stolen moment, every embrace, every betrayal, it was all right there, time-stamped and backed up in multiple places. I started digging deeper. If she was sloppy enough to think she could get away with this, what else had she left behind? I went through our phone records and found late-night calls and messages, always from the same number. I cloned her work laptop when she left it unattended in the office at home. She was careless, or maybe she thought I was too much of a fool to look. I wasn't. The messages I found gutted me. It wasn't just about the physical affair. It was the way she spoke to him, the way she confided in him like she used to do with me. They had inside jokes, plans, memories. This wasn't some meaningless fling. It was worse. It was a second life, one where I didn't exist except as an inconvenience. And the worst part? Susan knew. I replayed the nights in my head, the little things I had ignored. The way she hesitated when I asked about Whitney. The way she deflected, the way she tried to keep conversations short. She had covered for her. Lied to me. Let this happen under her own roof while my kids slept in the next room. That betrayal cut just as deep. But I wasn't about to lose control. Not yet. If I wanted to end this the right way, I had to be patient. I had to set the stage. Whitney had gotten too comfortable. Too confident. She thought she had me wrapped around her finger, still playing the role of the clueless husband. She had no idea I was watching her every move, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when she mentioned her upcoming legal retreat. I'll be gone Friday through Sunday, she said over dinner, casually sipping her wine. A big corporate case, lots of meetings. It's going to be exhausting. I smiled, nodded. That sounds rough. Want me to take care of the kids while you're gone? She smiled back, almost grateful. That would be great. Thank you, baby. Baby. The word felt like poison. There was a time when it meant something, when it carried warmth, love, familiarity. I remembered the nights she'd say it softly, her fingers tracing circles on my skin, back when we were still us. But now it was empty. A reflex. A lie. She had no idea that I knew exactly where she was going. That I had already seen her make this plan over text. She had booked a hotel, all right, but not for business. She had booked it under a fake name. For him. The moment she walked out the door that Friday morning, duffel bag in hand, I made my move. I picked up my phone and called Susan. Susan, I need you to come over, I said, my voice tight with barely contained anger. There's something you need to see. There was a pause. Jerry, Now. 20 minutes later, Susan stood in my living room. She was nervous, shifting her weight from foot to foot, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She knew something was wrong. Maybe she had expected anger. Shouting. Accusations. Instead, I reached for my laptop and hit play. The footage spoke for itself. She watched as Whitney arrived at her guest house late at night. Watched as she smoothed her hair, checked her phone, and opened the door for the man who wasn't her husband. Watched as they kissed, laughed, disappeared into the bedroom. Susan's face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth, her breathing shallow and erratic. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She shook her head, stepping back slightly as if distance could undo what she had just seen. Jerry, I didn't think. Her words broke off as tears welled in her eyes, her gaze darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape. Oh my God. I let the video play a little longer before shutting it off. Silence stretched between us. She made me promise not to tell, Susan finally whispered, eyes darting to me, searching for some kind of understanding. She said it would ruin everything if you found out. She told me it was temporary, that it didn't mean anything. I didn't know how to tell you, Jerry. I thought maybe she would stop. I stared at her, cold and unmoving. She wasn't going to weasel her way out of this with half-hearted excuses. You let my kids sleep in that house while this was happening. Susan's shoulders slumped. You lied to me. Tears welled in her eyes. Jerry, please. I shook my head. You're fired. Her mouth opened as if to argue, to beg, to plead her case. But I wasn't interested in hearing it. I had wasted enough time being lied to. Susan hesitated for a moment, her mouth opening as if she wanted to say something, but then she just turned and walked out. Her steps were slow at first, then quickened, almost frantic. She fumbled with the doorknob before disappearing outside, leaving only the echo of the door clicking shut behind her. I stood in my quiet house, my kids playing in the next room, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. I wasn't done yet. No, the real reckoning was still to come. Whitney returned home on Sunday night, all smiles, her heels clicking against the floor as she stepped inside. But the second she saw me, she froze. I was sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded in front of me. Spread out before me were the printed messages, screenshots, and still frames from the nanny cam. A thick envelope sat beside them. I watched her eyes dart to the evidence, her face shifting from confusion to something else, fear. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, my gaze never leaving hers. "Divorce papers." She let out a shaky laugh, but it died quickly when I didn't react. "Jerry, wait." "Save it," I snapped, pushing one of the photos toward her. It was a still frame of her and him, locked in an embrace just before they disappeared into Susan's bedroom. "You think you're smart? Using the nanny's house so I wouldn't find out? You played me, Whitney. But now, the game's over." Her breath hitched. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I cut her off. "I have weeks' worth of proof. Every text. Every call. Every single time you snuck off thinking I wouldn't notice. And if you try to fight me on this, I'll make sure the court sees every disgusting thing you did. Tears welled in her eyes. Jerry, please. I stood up, towering over her. For years, she had made me feel small, like I was just some background character in her life. But not anymore. I want full custody, I continued, voice steady. You can have supervised visits, but that's it. And if you even think about dragging this out, I'll make sure the judge knows exactly what kind of mother abandons her kids to sneak off to a cheap motel with another man. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You can't just take them from me. I scoffed. Watch me. Her hands trembled as she reached out, as if she could somehow undo everything just by touching me. Jerry, I love you. Don't, I said, my voice cold. Don't insult me. Don't lie to my face. She broke down then, sobbing, trying to come up with some excuse, some explanation that might make me change my mind. But there was nothing left to say. I grabbed the envelope and shoved it into her hands. Get out. She stood there for a moment, stunned, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, slowly, she turned and walked to the door. She hesitated, looking back at me one last time. Maybe she thought I'd change my mind. Maybe she was hoping for some last-minute forgiveness. But I just stared at her, unflinching. She left. And I didn't feel even a shred of regret. A week passed. Whitney was living in a hotel, scrambling to put together a legal defense, but there was nothing she could do. My lawyer had already set everything in motion. The evidence I had gathered? It was more than enough to make sure she had no ground to stand on. Her lover? He disappeared the moment things got complicated. No surprise there. Men like him never stick around when reality comes crashing down. And Susan? She packed up and left town. I didn't hear from her again, and I didn't want to. As for me, I kept the house, got full custody of the kids. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was breathing fresh air instead of drowning. I wasn't the broken husband anymore. I wasn't the man who sat in silence, waiting for scraps of affection. I wasn't the fool who ignored the truth staring him in the face. I was free. One night, as I tucked Ava and Dylan into bed, Dylan yawned and grabbed my hand. Dad? Yeah, bud. He looked up at me sleepily. You're smiling. I blinked. I hadn't even realized it. But he was right. I ruffled his hair and kissed his forehead. Guess I am. As I turned off the lights and closed their door, I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in a long, long time, I felt something I thought I had lost. Peace,